The galaxy had forgotten what humans looked like. 4,000 years was a long time, even for species that lived for centuries. The elder races remembered, but they rarely spoke of it. When young aliens asked about the old stories, their elders would change the subject or simply walk away. Humanity had become a legend, a ghost story told in the dark corners of space stations. Some said they had destroyed themselves. Others claimed they had evolved beyond physical form. Most simply believed they had never existed at all. Commander Ellen stood in the observation deck of Station Whisper, watching the stars turn slowly beyond the reinforced glass. The station floated at the very edge of known space, hidden inside a dying nebula where no one ever looked. It was humanity's last outpost, their final connection to a galaxy that had asked them to leave. Lieutenant approached her with a data pad in his hands. He was young, barely 30 years old, and he had never seen an alien in person. None of the younger generation had. They had grown up hearing stories from their grandparents about the old days, about the Alliance and the war and the terrible choice that followed. "Commander, we're picking up something strange on the deep-range sensors," said. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his excitement. Nothing strange ever happened at Station Whisper. That was the whole point. Ellen took the data pad and studied the readings. Her heart began to beat faster as she recognized the signal pattern. It was old, impossibly old, using a communication protocol that hadn't been active for 4. She had learned about it in the academy, studied it as a historical curiosity. No one ever expected to actually receive it. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. He shook his head. "I've never seen anything like it. The computer can't even identify the source species." Ellen said quietly. "This is an emergency beacon coded specifically for human receivers. They're asking for help." His face went pale. They were real. The stories were real. And somewhere out there, someone was calling for humanity to return. Across the galaxy, Ambassador sat in his private chamber on the and waited. He was old, older than any of his kind should be, kept alive by machines and medicine and sheer stubborn will. He remembered the humans. He had been a child when they left, standing in the crowds as their ships rose into the sky and vanished into the darkness between stars. He remembered crying, though he never understood why. They were coming. Everyone knew it now. The Dominion had consumed 3 systems in the past year alone, their hunger for resources driving them forward like a plague across the stars. The Galactic Concord had sent diplomatic missions, offered treaties and trade agreements, tried every peaceful solution their civilization had developed over thousands of years. They had eaten the diplomats, had watched the Concord debate and argue and delay while world after world fell silent. He had watched High Counselor make speeches about patience and understanding, while refugees flooded into the core systems with stories of horror. And finally, he had done something no one had dared to do in 4,000 years. He had activated the old beacon, the one his grandmother had shown him when he was young, the one that supposedly connected to those who had promised to return if they were ever truly needed. He did not know if the humans still existed. He did not know if they would answer. He only knew that the Conquered could not save his people, and the only other option was waiting to die. Back at Station Whisper, Ellen had gathered her senior staff in the command center. There were only 12 of them, the entire crew of humanity's forgotten outpost. They stared at the decoded message playing on the main screen, listening to an alien voice speaking words that had not been directed at humans for. "Please," the recording said, "if anyone can hear this, we need you. The darkness is coming and we cannot stop it alone. We were wrong to send you away. We were afraid and we were foolish and we have regretted it every day since. Please come back. Please help us, please." The room was silent when the message ended, wiped his eyes and pretended he wasn't crying. Ellen stood perfectly still, her mind racing through 4,000 years of history, 4,000 years of exile, 4,000 years of wondering if they would ever be forgiven. "Commander," said Dr. Price, the station's historian, "you know what answering this would mean. We made a promise when we left. We said we would never return unless we were called." "I know," Ellen said. "The protocols are clear. We have to contact Earth. We have to get authorization from the Council. That will take months, maybe years, knowing how slowly they move." Ellen turned to face her crew. "The message came to us. We're the ones who have to decide." Stepped forward. "Commander, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old alliance. He said the humans and the were like family once. He said we left because we did something terrible, something we couldn't forgive ourselves for. But he also said that someday we would have a chance to make it right." Ellen nodded slowly. She had heard the same stories. Every human child learned them eventually. The Great War, the desperate battle, the moment when human soldiers lost control and killed far more than they should have. The shame that followed, the accusations from their allies, the decision to withdraw rather than risk ever losing themselves again. 4,000 years they had spent in silence, watching from the edges, never interfering, never helping, never hurting. 4,000 years of learning patience, learning control, learning to be something better than what they had been. And now someone was asking them to come back. Ellen walked to the main console and placed her hand on the transmission controls. She thought about the conquered and their rules, about Earth and their protocols, about 4 of isolation and the promise they had made. Then she thought about that voice on the recording, the fear and the hope and the desperate plea for help. "Send the response," she said. "Tell them we heard them. Tell them we're coming." The signal went out into the void, carrying humanity's answer across the stars. An old ambassador wept with joy as his console lit up with a message he had never truly believed he would receive. On distant stations and outposts, species that had forgotten humans existed began to pick up strange transmissions and wonder what they meant. The long silence was over. Humanity was returning, and the galaxy would soon remember why they had once feared them, and why they had once loved them, and why some mistakes take 4,000 years to fix. The news spread through the galactic conquered like fire through dry grass. Someone had answered the ancient beacon. Someone had responded to a signal that should have been dead for 4,000 years. At first, most species refused to believe it. Humans were myths, legends from a darker age, stories that parents told their children to make them behave. But the transmission was real, by a dozen independent sources, and it carried a simple message that sent shockwaves through every civilization in known space. "We heard you, we are coming." Ambassador stood before the full assembly of the conquered, his old body trembling with exhaustion but his voice clear and strong. Behind him, the great viewing screen showed the approaching armada, thousands of ships moving through the void like a swarm of hungry insects. In 3 days they would reach in 4, there would be nothing left to save. "You activated an illegal beacon," High Counselor said coldly. He was a tall creature with silver scales and eyes that never seemed to blink. "You contacted a species that was banished from galactic society. You have violated every protocol we have." "I saved my people," replied, "something you were unwilling to do." Scales rippled with anger. The humans were removed from the conquered for good reason. They were violent beyond measure, incapable of restraint, dangerous to everyone around them. Bringing them back could doom us all. "They are already dooming us. At least the humans might give us a chance." The debate raged for hours while the enemy fleet drew closer. Some species supported, desperate for any hope of survival. Others sided with, terrified of what humanity might do if unleashed upon the galaxy again. Old records were cited, ancient testimony reviewed, and accusations flew back and forth across the chamber. None of it mattered when the human fleet arrived. They came out of fold space without warning, appearing in the skies above the like ghosts emerging from a dream. There were only 12 ships, small and sleek, and built in designs that no one recognized. They looked nothing like the massive warships described in the old histories. They looked almost peaceful. Admiral Nora Collins stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the sensor readings fill her screens. She was a small woman with hair and kind eyes, chosen to lead this mission not for her tactical brilliance but for her patience and her compassion. The Council back on Earth had been very clear about what this mission was supposed to accomplish. They were not here to conquer. They were not here to dominate. They were here to help and nothing more. "Admiral, we're receiving hails from approximately 600 sources," reported Lieutenant Commander Danny, her chief pilot. Most of them seemed to be asking the same question. "What question?" "Are we real?" Nora almost smiled. 4,000 years of silence could make anyone seem like a myth. Open a general channel, let them see us. The transmission went out to every ship and station in the system. Species across the Concord watched in stunned amazement as a human face appeared on their screens, looking older and softer than the stories had described, looking almost ordinary. "This is Admiral Nora Collins of the Earth Expeditionary Fleet," she said calmly. "We received your distress call and we have come to offer assistance. We mean no harm to anyone who does not threaten innocent lives. We are simply here to help." On the Concord assembly floor, watched the transmission with barely concealed fury. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Humanity was supposed to stay gone, forgotten, erased from history. He had spent his entire career making sure the truth about their exile remained buried. Now everything was falling apart. Dr. Peter Grant had spent 40 years studying the classified records from before the exile. He was the foremost expert on human galactic relations, one of only a handful of people who knew what really happened 4,000 years ago. Now he stood beside Nora on the bridge, watching the reactions come in from across the Concord. "They're afraid of us," he said quietly. "4 of propaganda will do that. Then we'll have to show them they're wrong." Nora turned to face him. "You said you found evidence that could change everything. Is it solid?" Peter nodded slowly. "The official history says we went berserk during the battle that we killed millions of civilians in a blind rage. That's why we were asked to leave. But the records I found tell a different story. We didn't attack civilians. We protected them." "Then why did they blame us?" "Because protecting them meant disobeying direct orders from the Conquered. They told us to retreat and let the enemy have the planet. We refused. We stayed and fought until every civilian was evacuated. The Conquered leadership couldn't admit they were willing to sacrifice an entire world, so they made us the villains instead." Nora closed her eyes for a moment, processing what this meant. Her ancestors had not been monsters. They had been heroes, punished for caring too much, exiled for refusing to let innocent people die. The shame that humanity had carried for 4,000 years was based on a lie. Before she could respond, the sensors lit up with new contacts. They had sent an envoy ship, small and fast, racing ahead of the main fleet. It broadcast on all channels, demanding attention. "Humans," the commander snarled, "we have heard the stories about your kind. Surrender now and we will make your deaths quick. Resist and we will devour your worlds as we have devoured so many others." The bridge fell silent. Every eye turned to Nora, waiting for her response. She thought about the lies and the exile and the 4,000 years of patient waiting. She thought about the people on the planet below, counting on them for protection. She thought about what it truly meant to be human. "Commander," she said finally, her voice carrying across every open channel in the system. "We spent 4,000 years learning patience. Do not mistake our silence for weakness. Do not mistake our compassion for cowardice. We came here to help our friends and we will not abandon them. If you want this world, you will have to go through us." The envoy ship turned and fled back to the main fleet. Millions of people watched the human admiral's message replay on their screens and began to hope for the first time in months. In the Conquered assembly, realized that everything he had worked to hide was about to come undone. The battle for the would begin at dawn. 12 human ships against thousands of warships. The odds were impossible. but humanity had never been very good at understanding when they were supposed to lose. The sun rose over thee, and the sky filled with fire. Captain Danny gripped his controls as his ship dove through a wall of enemy fighters, spinning and weaving through a storm of weapons fire that would have torn lesser vessels apart. Around him, the other human ships moved like dancers, their movements perfectly coordinated, their shields flashing with every impact. The armada stretched across the horizon, thousands of ships darkening the stars like a living shadow. Warlord watched from his command vessel as the tiny human fleet engaged his forces, expecting to see them crumble within minutes. Instead, he watched in growing confusion as ship after ship failed to destroy even a single human vessel. "What are they doing?" he demanded. "Why won't they die?" His officers had no answer. The human ships were using technology they had never encountered, weapons that disabled rather than destroyed, shields that seemed to absorb energy rather than simply deflect it. 4,000 years of isolation had not been wasted. Humanity had spent every moment preparing for the day they might be needed again. Lieutenant Maya Santos sat at the weapons console of Danny's ship, her fingers dancing across the controls as she targeted engine systems and power cores rather than life support and crew quarters. Every shot was precise, calculated to remove enemies from the fight without killing them. It felt wrong to her, holding back when their survival was at stake. "Danny, I don't understand why we're not using lethal force," she said between attacks. "They're trying to kill us. They're trying to kill everyone on that planet." Danny dodged another barrage of missiles before answering. "Because that's exactly what got us exiled in the first place. Our ancestors lost control during battle. They stopped thinking about who they were fighting and just started destroying everything in front of them. We swore we would never let that happen again. But we're outnumbered 100-1. If we don't fight at full strength, we're going to lose." "Maybe, but we're going to lose as humans, not as monsters." On the planet below, billions have watched the battle unfold on their screens. They had grown up hearing stories about human brutality, about the savage warriors who had been cast out for their violence. Now they watched those same humans risk their lives to protect them while refusing to kill more than absolutely necessary. It was nothing like the stories had described. Ambassador stood in a crowded shelter, surrounded by frightened civilians who flinched at every explosion in the sky above. A young named pushed through the crowd to reach him, his eyes wide with confusion. "Ambassador, why are the humans holding back? The historical records say they were unstoppable killers. Why aren't they destroying the fleet?" Smiled sadly. "Because the historical records lied, child. The humans I remember were not killers, they were protectors, they were our friends, and I think after 4,000 years they still are." In orbit, the tide of battle began to turn against the human fleet. They adapted quickly, learning to overwhelm individual ships with concentrated fire before their shields could recover. Admiral Nora Collins watched from her flagship as the vessel commanded by Captain Lisa took critical damage, its engines failing, its shields collapsing under the relentless assault. "All ships converge on this position," Nora ordered. "We need to cover their evacuation." "Admiral, if we break formation, we lose our defensive advantage," Danny protested over the comm. "They will tear us apart." "Captain has 200 crew members on that ship. We are not leaving them behind." The human fleet wheeled around, abandoning their carefully planned positions to shield their wounded companion. They pressed their advantage, pouring fire into the gaps that opened in the human formation. 3 more ships took heavy damage. One lost all power and began drifting toward the planet's atmosphere. Warlord finally allowed himself to smile. The humans were fools, sacrificing tactical superiority to save a single crew. He gave the order to concentrate all fire on the drifting vessel, eager to claim his first human kill. Danny saw what was happening and made a choice without hesitation. He pushed his ship between the drifting vessel and the incoming barrage, absorbing hits that should have torn him apart. His shield screamed in protest. Warning alarms filled the bridge. Maya shouted something he couldn't hear over the noise. Then the civilian evacuation ships from the planet's surface rose through the atmosphere, carrying the first wave of refugees to safety. Danny watched them pass overhead, thousands of lives that would have been lost if the human fleet hadn't held the line. "Admiral," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the failing systems, "the civilians are clear." Nora closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything they had lost. 3 ships destroyed, hundreds of crew members dead or wounded. The still outnumbered them by an impossible margin. "All ships fall back to defensive positions around the evacuation corridor," she ordered. "We've bought them time. Now we need to buy them more." The human fleet retreated in good order, their remaining ships forming a protective wall between the planet and the enemy armada. They had lost the first engagement, but they had done something far more important than winning. They had shown the galaxy who they really were. On news screens across the Concord, the footage played on repeat. Human ships taking hits meant for evacuating civilians. Human crews sacrificing themselves to protect people who weren't even their own species. Human warriors choosing mercy over efficiency, compassion over conquest. In the Concord assembly, species that had spent 4,000 years believing the old propaganda began to ask uncomfortable questions. If humans were truly the monsters the records described, why were they dying to save strangers? If they were incapable of restraint, why were they holding back even now, even with their own survival at stake? High Counselor watched his carefully constructed lies begin to crumble, and for the first time in his long life, he felt something close to fear. The battle was far from over. They were regrouping for another assault, their numbers barely dented despite the day's fighting. The human fleet was battered and bleeding, held together by determination and nothing else. But something had changed. The galaxy was watching now, really watching, and what they saw was not the enemy they had been taught to fear. What they saw was something far more dangerous to those who had built their power on lies. What they saw was the truth. The human flagship drifted in orbit above its hull by 100 impacts, its crew exhausted from days of constant battle. Admiral Nora Collins had not slept in 50 hours, but she forced herself to stand straight as the Concord representatives filed into her conference room. This meeting would decide everything. Commander Ellen had arrived with the second wave of human reinforcements, 6 more ships that brought their total to 15. It wasn't enough to win, not against the armada that still numbered in the thousands, but it was enough to keep fighting. She stood beside Nora now, watching the alien diplomats take their seats with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely hidden hostility. High Counselor sat at the head of the delegation, his silver scales gleaming under the harsh ship lighting. He had fought against this meeting, argued that the humans could not be trusted, warned that their presence would only make things worse. But the other species had overruled him. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. "Before we discuss anything else," said coldly, "I want to know why humanity has returned. Your species was exiled for crimes against galactic civilization. What makes you think you have the right to involve yourselves in our affairs?" Nora stepped forward, her voice calm and measured. "We returned because someone asked for help. That's all. We have no interest in conquest or domination. We simply want to protect innocent lives." "Protect them. Your ancestors slaughtered millions at the Battle of. You destroyed entire cities in your blind rage. The records are very clear about what humanity is capable of." "The records are lies." Everyone turned to look at Counselor Myra, who had stepped forward from her position near the wall. She was Earth's official representative, chosen by the Human Council for her diplomatic skills and her unshakable composure. In her hands, she carried a data pad containing evidence that would change everything. For the past 4,000 years, humanity has been living with shame that was never ours to carry, Myra said quietly. We believed we had committed terrible crimes. We believed our exile was justified. But Dr. Grant has discovered records that tell a different story. She activated the data pad, projecting images and documents onto the conference room screens. The other delegates leaned forward, studying the evidence with growing shock, even seemed disturbed by what he was seeing. The Battle of was not a massacre, Myra continued. It was a rescue operation. The conquered leadership ordered a full retreat from the planet, abandoning 12 million civilians to enemy occupation. Human commanders refused to obey. They stayed behind and fought to evacuate every single person they could save. That's impossible, sputtered. The official records clearly state. The official records were. Myra's voice hardened. The conquered leadership at the time could not admit that they had been willing to sacrifice an entire world, so they blamed the humans instead. They called our refusal to retreat a rampage. They called our protection of civilians a massacre. They turned our greatest act of compassion into proof of our barbarism. The room fell silent. Ambassador sat in the corner, tears streaming down his aged face. He had always suspected the truth, always wondered why his memories of humans were so different from the stories. Now he finally understood. My grandmother was on, he said softly. She was 7 years old when the evacuation order came. A human soldier carried her to the last transport ship. He died protecting the landing zone so the ship could take off safely. She remembered his face until the day she died. One by one, other delegates began sharing their own stories. Fragments of memory passed down through generations, tales of human kindness that had never quite fit the official narrative. A pilot who sacrificed his ship to save an alien colony. A medic who stayed behind to treat wounded enemies. A commander who refused to fire on a surrendering vessel even when ordered to destroy it. The picture that emerged was nothing like the monster the conquered had described. The humans were fierce, yes. They were capable of tremendous violence when necessary. But they were also compassionate beyond measure, protective of anyone they considered innocent, willing to die for principles that other species had abandoned long ago. Watched his power crumbling with every new testimony. He had built his career on the foundation of human exile, using the fear of their return to consolidate control over the conquered. Now that foundation was collapsing, and everyone could see the rot that had been hiding underneath. This changes nothing, he said desperately. Even if the old records were wrong, they are still coming. What can 15 ships do against an armada? Perhaps more than 15, said a new voice. The fleet commander had entered the room, her uniform crisp despite the chaos of the past days. Behind her, holographic displays showed ships from a dozen different species moving into formation alongside the human vessels. My people have voted, she announced. 4,000 years ago, we let fear convince us to abandon our friends. We will not make that mistake again. The fleet stands with humanity. Before could respond, another voice joined in. Then another. Species that had been enemies for centuries found themselves agreeing on something for the first time. The collective, all of them pledging their ships and their soldiers to the human cause. You're all fools, hissed. That will destroy you all. Maybe, Nora said quietly. But we would rather die fighting beside our friends than live hiding behind lies. On the planet below, Young watched the news feeds with growing excitement. Ships were gathering from across the galaxy, forming the largest allied fleet in recorded history. His grandmother's stories about the old alliance were coming true, 4,000 years later than anyone had expected. A message came through on the emergency channels. They had responded to the growing coalition with a threat of their own. They had called their full armada from the far rim, every ship they possessed, every warrior they could muster. The final battle would happen in 3 days, and it would decide the fate of the entire galaxy. Ellen stood beside Nora on the bridge of the flagship, watching the Allied ships take formation. There were hundreds of them now, a rainbow of different designs and technologies, united by a common cause for the first time in living memory. "We started this mission with 12 ships," Ellen said. "Now look at us." Nora nodded slowly. "We spent 4,000 years alone, wondering if we would ever be forgiven, wondering if we deserved to be. And now we have something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if it comes to that." The stars seemed brighter somehow, as if the universe itself was watching to see what would happen next. The long silence was truly over. Humanity had returned, and this time they were not alone. The Allied fleet filled the space above the like a living constellation. Ships from 50 different species flew in formation, their designs as varied as the cultures that had built them, their purposes unified for the first time in galactic history. At the heart of the formation, the human vessels held position, their hulls standing as testament to the battles already fought. Admiral Nora Collins stood on her bridge and looked out at the gathered armada. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. 4,000 years of exile, and now this. Humanity was not just returning to the galaxy. They were helping to build something new. "Admiral, the fleet is entering the system," Lieutenant reported from his station. He had transferred to the flagship after his own ship was destroyed in the first engagement. His voice was steady now, all traces of his earlier nervousness gone. "Sensors count over 3,000 vessels. They're moving in standard assault formation." Nora nodded calmly. They had expected this. Warlord had gathered every ship his people possessed, determined to crush the Alliance in a single, overwhelming attack. He believed numbers would win the day. He was about to learn otherwise. "Open a channel to all Allied vessels," Nora said. "I want everyone to hear this." The communication officers made it happen, connecting Nora's voice to every ship in the fleet. Billions of beings across the galaxy watched as she stepped forward, her image broadcast on screens from the core worlds to the outer rim. 4,000 years ago, humanity left the galactic community," she began. "We believed we had failed you. We believed our passion for protecting others had become a weapon that could not be controlled. So we spent 4 learning patience, learning restraint, learning to be worthy of the friends we had lost." She paused, looking at the faces of her bridge crew, humans and aliens now serving side by side. "We did not return to conquer. We did not return to dominate. We returned because someone needed help and we could not ignore that call. Today, we fight not as humans or any single species. Today, we fight as a galaxy united. Today, we show that there are some things stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than the hunger that drives them across the stars." The fleet responded with a roar of approval that crossed every communication channel, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very fabric of space. "All ships engage." The battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. The Allied fleet moved as one, coordinating attacks across dozens of different tactical systems, covering each other's weaknesses, amplifying each other's strengths. Human ships led the charge, their advanced technology carving paths through enemy formations, creating openings that Allied vessels exploited with devastating efficiency. Captain Danny flew at the front of the assault wing, his damaged ship held together by emergency repairs and pure determination. Beside him flew the young who had volunteered for combat duty despite having no military training. They had become friends over the past days, their bond proof that the old alliance could be rebuilt. "Danny, I'm picking up unusual readings from the command ship," reported. "Their shields are cycling in a strange pattern. I think it might be a weakness." Danny studied the data and felt his heart skip. Was right. The flagship had a flaw in its defensive systems, a brief window every few seconds when a precisely aimed shot could penetrate directly to the power core. But reaching that position would mean flying through the heaviest concentration of enemy fire in the entire battle. Admiral Collins, Danny transmitted. We found their weak point. I'm sending the coordinates now. Nora received the data and immediately understood what it would take. Someone would have to make a direct run at the command ship, absorbing everything that could throw at them, holding course long enough to get a clear shot. It was almost certainly a suicide mission. I'll do it, Danny said before she could ask. Negative, Captain. I will not order anyone to their death. You're not ordering, I'm volunteering. Before the argument could continue, another voice cut across the channel. Ambassador, ancient and frail, speaking from the bridge of a small diplomatic vessel that had no business being anywhere near a battlefield. Captain, this is my responsibility, said. 4,000 years ago, my people let fear destroy the greatest alliance the galaxy had ever known. We sent away our best friends because we were too afraid to stand with them. Today, I will make that right. Ambassador, your ship has no weapons. You can't. I don't need weapons. I only need to reach the command ship. My reactor will do the rest. Nora felt tears forming in her eyes as she understood what was planning. A single ship, flying directly into the heart of the enemy formation, detonating its power core at point-blank range. It would destroy the flagship and most likely himself. There has to be another way, she said. There isn't, and even if there was, this is my choice. His voice was peaceful, almost happy. I have lived 4,000 years longer than I should have, kept alive by machines and medicine and stubborn hope. I stayed alive because I believed this day would come. I believed humanity would return and I wanted to be here to see it. Now I have. Now I can finally rest. His ship broke formation and accelerated toward the enemy line. They turned their weapons on him, pouring fire into his tiny vessel, but flew like a creature possessed, dodging and weaving through the storm of destruction with skills no one knew he possessed. Danny flew alongside him, his ship absorbing hits meant for the ambassador, buying precious seconds with every passing moment. Joined them, then a dozen other pilots, then 100, all of them forming a protective shell around the small diplomatic ship that was about to change everything. Reached the command ship with seconds to spare, his vessel burning, his shields gone, his hull breached in a dozen places. He looked at the image of the massive flagship filling his and smiled. This is for the friends we abandoned, he whispered. This is for the alliance we destroyed. This is for the 4,000 years we wasted being afraid. The explosion lit up the sky above visible even from the planet's surface. The command ship vanished in a ball of fire, taking Warlord and his entire command staff with it. Without leadership, the fleet began to fracture, ships breaking formation, individual captains making contradictory decisions. The Allied fleet pressed their advantage. Within hours they were in full retreat, their invasion shattered, their dominion broken. The battle was over. The galaxy was saved. In the aftermath, as rescue ships collected the wounded and repair crews began their endless work, a memorial was built on It listed the names of everyone who had fallen in the battle, human and alien side by side. At the very top, carved in letters that would last was the name of an old ambassador who had waited 4,000 years to make things right. Counselor Myra addressed the Galactic Concord for the first time as an official member. Humanity was welcomed back into galactic society, not as warriors or conquerors, but as partners in building something better. High Counselor was removed from power, and the truth about humanity's exile became part of official history, a reminder of what fear and lies could cost. Commander Ellen stood on the observation deck of Station Whisper, now a bustling hub of cooperation rather than a lonely outpost at the edge of nowhere. Stood beside her, wearing the uniform of the 1st Joint Human Diplomatic Corps. Was with them, his friendship with having evolved into something that would help shape galactic relations for generations to come. We spent 4,000 years in silence, Ellen said softly, watching, waiting, wondering if we would ever be allowed to come home. Was it worth it? Asked, All those years alone. Ellen watched a group of children playing in the station's garden, human, and a dozen other species mixed together, laughing and chasing each other without any awareness of the history that had almost kept them apart forever. Every moment, she said, every single moment. The stars stretched out before them, no longer cold and empty but full of promise, full of potential, full of friends waiting to be made. Humanity had spent 4,000 years learning patience. Now they had an eternity to learn something even more important. How to belong.